Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, the moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. Before we get started with today's webinar, I do have a few housekeeping items I need to go over with you. First of all, today's webinar is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the webinar, please know that you will receive a link post-event that will take you to the webinar on demand. And we are going to be taking audience questions throughout today's event. So if you have a question at any time, please use your control panel and submit your questions. And we will take about 15 minutes near the end of the presentation, and we'll go through those audience questions. Okay, today we have a great webinar. Are your cloud applications performing? How application performance management can give you insights. Our speakers today are Randy George, who is Distinguished Engineer, Application Performance Management at IBM. And he's going to be joined by Ken Ryder, Architect at Capstone Consulting, and John Dinger, Business Solutions Architect at Capstone Consulting. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, great. Well, John, I think you are going to be taking the controls, so I'm going to go ahead and just turn it right over to you and let you do your thing.
All right. Thanks a lot, Charlene. So this is John Dinger speaking, and as Charlene just told us, I got the good fortune of working with a close colleague and a former colleague of mine on the talk today. So actually, Ken, would you say hello just so folks can hear your voice?
Hello, this is Ken Ryder.
All right, and Randy?
Yeah, hi, it's Randy George.
Okay, so now for reference, that's what they are. So Ken and I are with Capstone Consulting, which is based in the Midwestern U.S., and we're part of a practice that specializes in cloud and container solutions, especially as it relates to helping clients bring their key business applications into the reality of cloud and container. And we have the scars to be a Docker Premier partner and a Microsoft Gold partner. I could reasonably say that when Docker wants to release any new capabilities in Azure, we're generally their first point of contact when they're ready to let their pre-beta code slip out of their lab. I probably don't need to introduce IBM. You probably know they started out building scales and meat slicers for the package industry. Then they expanded to invent things like large-scale computing and data communications and computing hardware virtualization and some other Nobel Prize winning stuff over the years. So that's who we are here today. And I would like to give you some insight with what we're going to take you through regarding the work that we've done to help our clients modernize their traditional business applications. And when I say those words, I mean containerizing apps, taking them to cloud and hybrid deployment topologies, and optionally, along the way, refactoring those apps or partially refactoring parts of those applications to use cloud-native technologies and microservice architectures. And I want to repeat that last part, optionally refactoring. We found that clients can get some significant benefits simply from containerization and exploitation of cloud infrastructure topologies. We'll be defining for you what are the business challenges that forces companies to make this work or to undertake this work in the reality of today's IT organizations, give you some details into some of the cases that we've helped clients execute, and then also talk about how APM is playing an essential role in helping to guide this modernization work, and subsequent to that, how APM helps demonstrate the results of the work and refine the activity for the next iteration. And then we'll end up with a summary of some of the lessons learned and the conclusions that we've made so far in this journey. So again, why do businesses modernize apps? As with everything else in business today, it's all about improving the competitiveness and the profitability of the business and its operations. Randy and Ken and I have worked very closely with dozens and dozens of large and small companies over the years. And what we've heard from them, supported by a large body of market research from the likes of Gartner and other main consultants, is that companies are spending close to 80% of their IT budgets on average just to keep their current applications operational, just to keep the lights on. 80%. That means they've only got about 20% of their overall budget left to do things like create something new or innovate. And last October, Gartner published some research that said if you look 5 years out into the future, those companies are going to still be using 90% of those applications because they're still going to be essential to the business. So the challenge that places in front of all the companies that we're working with is, what are they going to do to modify the spend that they currently have on those applications so that they can redeploy some of that budget into creating innovation, driving new business value? Ideally, if a business can figure out how to make their applications a lot easier to maintain and more predictable and reliable for the delivery of updates, they can make them better monitored and better understood so that they know, are the updates, are the changes that they're producing working, are they delivering the desired business value, and make those applications so that they're much more responsive to the dynamic business needs. As new opportunities arise, as new competitive threats emerge, then businesses can begin to recapture part of that 80% of their spend, and they can redirect it into the area of functional innovations that can drive their business growth. And our experience is that cloud exploitation and application containerization enable businesses to start to shift that spend, and in some cases, shift it pretty dramatically. Regarding cloud, hybrid, multi-cloud, we're starting to see those everywhere. In fact, if you look at this year's State of the Cloud report from RightScale, they're saying that on the average, businesses are exploiting 4.8 clouds today. And they also say that public cloud is the most important platform for businesses. But if you think about that, you're exploiting 5 different clouds in your business applications, and often the company really doesn't even yet have the oversight of what that's about. Enterprise Monitoring Associates, EMA, says that the most important technology platform for today's businesses is private cloud. So, whether it's RightScale and it's public cloud or EMA and it's private cloud, either way, it's clear that cloud exploitation, when done right, is delivering real business value. And my personal opinion about the public-private question is that really offerings like the IBM new cloud private offering, Microsoft Azure Stack offerings that give you a single cloud experience that spans public and private, those are going to be compelling drivers in the market over the coming years because they offer businesses the flexibility and choice, and they don't pin them into public-private. They let them have consistency with the development, deployment, operations of their applications as the business needs require companies to shift their own focus. And then with containerization, what we have seen is just with containerization and before refactoring, we've seen significant improvements to companies' application development processes, to their change delivery processes, to the infrastructure costs, the virtualization licensing costs, deployment time, stability of updates. We've seen significant improvements which deliver real business value and agility just by the usage of containers with their lighter weight footprint, their consistent portable configuration across environments. And we're going to be taking you through examples of these points I've got over here on the right. So, for example, the flexible, available, scalable, portable as we go through this presentation. At the bottom right of this chart, the numbers that we've got sound pretty significant, but in fact, with the data that we're seeing out there, they're actually somewhat conservative. 10x improvement in the application delivery process. We're hearing major corporations that are talking about more than 20 times improvement. That's not percent, that's times. We say 99% faster updates, our experiences, we're seeing at least one more 9, so 99.9. 50% cost reduction seems about right, especially when you factor in VM license costs and better exploitation of the hardware footprint. And probably many of you, given that this is a DevOps audience, have seen some of these same types of improvements in your organizations. This slide 4 here, I wanted to zoom in on a couple of the improvements to the production and deployment of applications with a couple of simple data points. So back in the 2000s and the 2000 teens, my development organizations were building big software products. And if we look over on the left side of this chart, this data is from 2012, so historical perspective here. Businesses wanted application updates, within a 3 to 6 month time window. And back then, the development teams generally weren't able to keep up with that. Now, if you look at where we are today, those times might seem somewhat glacial, especially speaking to a DevOps audience. But back then, our development processes and frankly, our clients' adoption capabilities were not really able to keep up any faster than that. If we look on the right-hand side of this chart, this is the most recent version of the EMA DevOps / continuous delivery report, which they've been publishing now for 6 years. Today, and again, these are DevOps companies we're talking about here, but they're reporting that more than half of the companies are deploying new code at least once a week, which is a pretty dramatic change in the broad landscape over that time period. And consistently over the 6 years that they've been publishing this report that I've mentioned, there's a strong correlation that the companies that are deploying their software updates more frequently, so increasing the frequency of update deployments, there's a significant correlation that those companies are growing at greater than 25% year-over-year revenue growth. Now, it's one of these interesting correlations. And the first year that it came out, everybody said, and now 6 years later, it's still there and it's strengthening. So the supposition is there's something behind this correlation, more than just a fluke in the numbers. So major growth opportunity there. And then, but again, try to get the DevOps audience excited, but look how much opportunity still exists. The last bullet there, most companies still haven't automated even half of their DevOps pipeline. So there's still a long way to go in terms of improvement. So hopefully this is helping you see how you can deliver value against some of these business drivers in your company. And now let's go look at some of the on-the-ground experience that we have been having as clients evolve into this space. So Ken, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, John. One of the things that when we go into a client and first ask them about what their goals are and what they want to get out of modernization, we go back and look at what are the factors that you need to consider. And in almost all cases, they're business drivers to these. They want to be able to achieve a higher scale. They want higher availability. They want to expand their reach to further regions, for example. There's a lot of abilities that they're trying to get out of their business applications. And they're trying to do that as cheap as they can, and they want to do it as fast as they can. That's typically the company that comes to us. Those are the reasons why they're coming to us. But some of the things that they're keeping them from doing it, existing technical debt in their applications. There's some environmental dependencies of the application. In a lot of cases, we're going into companies, they don't even know where the source code is, or they don't know who wrote it, or the people are not around anymore, or maybe they are and are off on some other project. They're also, obviously everybody's worrying about their budgets, their resources, their time. And then there's in most cases, there is some effort going towards DevOps, whether that's creating a CI/CD pipeline, whether that's doing additional logging, additional monitoring, tracking performance, and so on. There's a lot of factors that are going into them wanting to modernize their applications, but then they don't really know where to go after that. And so, John, if you'd go to the next slide. When we go in and talk to them, we first start off by asking them some questions. Do you know enough about your app to modernize it? Do you have the source code for it? Do you have any rework that has to happen with this application? Do you have the time, effort, people to devote to changing this application? Is there budget for modernizing this application? Or is there a trade-off, between modernizing this application or adding features to another application? And so we look at a lot of these questions from a customer and look at the other answers. We can actually create essentially a decision tree as to what we can or cannot do with that application. For example, if there's a large amount of technical debt, there's a large amount of rework that needs to happen, that may decide we go down one route. If there's none, or we don't have any people associated with that application, they don't know anything about the application, that may take us down another path. And so we end up coming to, if you would go to the next slide, John, we come up with essentially, we've essentially come up with 5 different ways of modernizing their application. Based upon their answers to the previous questions, we will look at if, for example, they don't know anything about their application. They have, for example, it's a Java app, they have a jar, and that's all they have. They don't know how it was built or anything. We may actually just take essentially a lift and shift approach, and we will take that application and we will run it in the container, standalone by itself. Just take that jar file and run it in a container. Even doing that, though, for them gives them some advantages. They get the scalability. They can run multiple containers. They get availability because it will restart if it fails. So they get some modernization advantages from that lift and shift approach, even if they don't even know anything about how that application was built or runs. So that's sort of the bottom tier of modernizing their application. If you go beyond that, Docker has a program they called Modernize Traditional Applications, which is essentially the lift and shift approach, but in a formal manner. You go through a process of selecting applications. They actually have some automation tools to help you create containers from legacy applications, and then provide a platform for running those on as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. Then there's the minimal refactoring. For example, if you have an application that's in pretty good shape and there's not a lot of time to make changes to it, but you do want a few changes to be made to it, and they're easy to make, you might start adding some of the essentially quote 12-factor app features to that application as you go through the process of converting it to a modern application. I skipped over one. Actually, the incremental refactor of microservices. In this case, you have an application that you want to modernize. You can easily see a way to convert it into a bunch of smaller apps that work together, or you can see ways to break pieces of it off and create an app for that while still maintaining that one monolith. And then over time, you will take, in either of those cases, you'll take the approach that I will continue to break apart that monolith into more and more apps until you get to the ultimate, microservice application with all the 12 factors. And just as a side note on the slide, we've been using 12-factor for a few years now in our talks with customers. I know that O'Reilly now has a new 15-factor app out there. So we expect that to change over time. So in all of these cases, one of the things that we'd like to do up front is we want to take a baseline of the application, not only from the way it exists as source code and so on, but also its performance. So we're actually looking at measuring its performance, and that could be performance of resources. It could be performance in regards to availability and so on. So that when we get to the end, we can actually then measure the performance again and show improvements in one or more dimensions. So John, if you go to the next slide. So I'm going to look at this flow that you see here is actually from Docker as part of their modernizing traditional applications program, and shows you sort of the process that we go through when we're looking at modernizing an application. So to start off with, we're looking at, we come in and basically learn as much as we can about the slide. Excuse me, about the application. Who are the subject matter experts? What OS is it running on? What language is it written in, and so on. We learn how that application is installed today on a server, how that application runs today on server or servers, what its dependencies are, and so on. We'll then use that information to convert it into a container or containers for Docker. We will then essentially run that on some developer's laptop and make sure that we can actually come up with the same answers that we did when that application runs on its own servers. We will then look at deploying this on a modern infrastructure, where what we consider the modern infrastructure is a Docker EE cluster. This could be a Kubernetes cluster as well, but we're running those containers on a modern infrastructure where those services are running on top of either bare metal, they're running on top of virtual machines in somebody's private cloud, or they're running on top of virtual machines in the hybrid cloud, or they're running as part of a container service in a public cloud. That part of it depends on the customer themselves, or the reality is they could run in all of those at the same time. And so then we've taken those apps that we converted to containers, we're now running them on a modern infrastructure. And as part of that, we're making sure that we integrate it into a CI/CD pipeline. If one doesn't exist, which turns out to be the case in a lot of companies, we actually will go in and create essentially a rudimentary CI/CD pipeline to automate the deployment of those applications. Along the way, usually having to work with the company on automated testing and so on, so that they can make future changes to it as they come to it. And ultimately, this gets them to the point where the customer themselves then can go off and continue that modernization of their application into microservices. So that's sort of the process we go through in modernizing an application with our customers. Along the way, there's a lot of performance that we're measuring throughout the entire environment, not just the application, but the entire environment itself. So from there, Randy, you want to?
Ken, I was going to comment in and feel free. So as you go through that modernization process, what we've seen the customers, and one thing you alluded to up front is taking a baseline, right? And it's a baseline of the application, not only consumption metrics like how much resources it's using, but you want to do some of the business metrics. You talked about the business wants to expand maybe regions, et cetera. They want to grow their business. So you want to understand what the current volumes is so that you can track increased volumes. You also want to not just take a look at the application, but take a look at the application dependencies. Keeping honest with it, but what we've been seeing is many of these apps aren't going to get fully modernized. Just maybe the front end, they're still going to continue to talk maybe to some of the back end traditional applications, data repositories, maybe even back to the mainframe, et cetera, that aren't going to be modernized, but those dependencies will still be in place, right? And this is where APM, I think, comes into a good play, because you can use the APM tool to auto-discover the application, the dependencies. You can measure these KPIs, both the business with respect to the app usage, as well as application consumption and things like that. And actually, one of the recommendations that we go in with is, most companies are doing some level of monitoring, right? But I'd recommend you actually take this baseline with the APM tool that you're going to be using to as you go through the modernization, right? That way you have comparative numbers, because that's what you want to do, compare the before and after as you stated, right? And different tools will calculate KPIs differently, right? So you want to make sure that you're dealing with apples to apples, if you would. So recommend coming in with an APM tool. It can auto-discover, track the dependencies, even the response time of the dependencies, build that graphic. Some customers we talk to don't even know what their applications look like with respect to the flow of data to the backends, and APM can help discover that as well. And then, as you said, going through moving to a more modern infrastructure, as well as building up a CD pipeline. Those are some of the things you also have to think about monitoring. It's not just the application. The modern infrastructure now becomes a critical extension of the app, right? With respect to, you're going to be having an API gateway into your backend service. You're going to be dealing with load balancing, the DNS, all that stuff has to be monitored as well. And then the pipeline, if you think about it, one of the reasons that John, you alluded to, was about needing the frequency of the agility for the business to make changes to stay competitive in this crazy world we're in these days, right? Well, if you cannot push these frequent updates out, then your app is basically, less agile. So your CD pipeline actually becomes an extension of the app. So you need to monitor that. That has to be performant. That has to be as available, or you're not going to be able to, produce and push out in production the frequency of apps. And in fact, there were some study done that even the new startups on an average are pushing about 50 times a day. I mean, we're not seeing that on the enterprise side, but some of these startups are literally pushing about 50 times a day on the average. So your pipeline is not available, not performant. That's going to slow this down as well. So anyways, John, if you want to go to the next chart. So this chart, we're going to kind of just I wanted to introduce some of the key aspects that you need to think about in monitoring. We'll go through a few more charts, Ken and I. But you want to think about some of these aspects, and APM will help greatly to monitor these aspects of it. End user experience, to me, that's number one, right? Obviously, your app has to be available. Not only do you have some level of an SLA with your business, I mean, some people are tracking to 3 nines, 3.9 availability, or 5 nines, or whatever your business is tracking to. You have to be able to show that your application is meeting those availability goals along with the SLA that you have to your business, right? Ken mentioned about as they modernize these apps, one of the reasons, one of many, is be able to extend the global reach, right, into new regions, as you said. So you really want to also be able to test the availability from those regions, right? Real world case, we had one app that they were monitoring, traditional way of monitoring. They weren't doing proactive monitoring from global regions, if you would, or global points of presence. They made some changes. They added in Google Analytics, and they never realized that they lost all the traffic from the Greater China region because of the slowdown of the Google Analytics in China. Made the application basically non-usable from an end user experience perspective. So here's another place where APM can help, is you can deploy synthetic bots into, or actually you can deploy tests into those bots in various geographic regions and emulate to make sure the application is available as well as responsive from those various geographic regions. So whether you're expanding or you just want to ensure that your customers from those various geographic regions are experiencing a good end user experience that's needed, APM can provide that as well. And similar, you don't just want to monitor your app, but again, the downstream dependencies, because obviously that impacts the overall end user experience. So some of these can be third-party services that folks use, a PayPal, Salesforce like that, as well as some of the infrastructure. We'll talk a little bit about resource consumption. That's always important because that's dollars, right? How much CPU, memory, network bandwidth, things like that, that your application uses. As you modernize this, you're going to see, some increase in network usage, for example, because of the chattiness of a loosely coupled application. Now, you want to monitor and make sure that it's still within budget. This is an area we always caution people think, we just turn on auto scaling, it fixes all problems. Fixes all problems except for budget problems. So if you have a poorly written app, auto scaling can actually mask, if you would, a problem, inefficient memory use or something like that. And we'll just keep auto scaling to make sure the responsiveness is good. However, you're getting to the point now where you are inefficient, thus costing more money. Cloud resources, whether they're public or private, are not free, right? So they're easy to obtain, but they're not free. So that's an area you have to pay attention to. Changes to the app. Ken, you kind of alluded to this when you talked about the change to the infrastructure. Well, the infrastructure, let's pick Kubernetes, as you mentioned, does a great job of ensuring that these microservices are always available the best that it can, right? So it will monitor, it'll kill and restart. It may actually kill and restart on a different node, right? And like I said, it can set up elastic scale, sometimes out, sometimes in. And you talked a little bit about the deployment patterns. So it's important that APM, which can manage all these things, and you have to look at, understand when these activities have happened, whether you scale in or out, whether you're restarted on a different node, etc. Because obviously changing and restarting on a different node can affect latency. Services failing and restarting, great. Kubernetes will keep your application alive from an end user. But if it's constantly killing and restarting, you have an underlying problem that you need to get attention to. And again, APM can give you insight into that. And with the various deployment methods, most people are running multiple versions of the service at any one time, and you have to understand the impact of that. And then last but definitely not least, that APM will give you that's important in monitoring these modern apps is usage analysis, which I call. We think about why did they do that, right? They want to be able to support more frequent changes. They want to be able to expand in regions, as Ken alluded to. They want to be able to dynamically introduce new features, etc. Well, APM can track literally to ensure that the volume has increased, or understand usage by geographies to make sure that you are getting that expansion. We can even understand what features are being used. So this is important as the business says, we got to quickly get these new features out to the market. Well, the feature uptake, are people really adopting those features, right? Now, this is more of an APM usage of the features, not an end user experience from a website. They clicked here, right? That's different. But in the APM, it's more around literally the usage of the volume, and by whom, and even reoccurring usage, right? And a lot of that can be looked at currently. If you're having a problem in a certain geography, and if 30% of that geography is reoccurring usage, you got to be focused on that, right? Because those are customers that you want to keep coming back to your app and driving business, if you would. Next one there. Thank you. And Ken, if you want to talk about now going through this process, right?
Yeah, and so part of what you're looking at in terms of modernizing an application is to get some of these capabilities that you're looking for in terms of especially scalability, availability, and so on, is looking at what are you going to use for orchestration. If you're in the container world, you're talking about things like Docker Swarm, or you're talking about Kubernetes. If you're in a VM or mixed world, you might be talking about some vSphere services, or you may be talking about something like HashiCorp's Nomad in order to scale up and scale out services or restart services and so on. That selection of the orchestrator can, as Randy alluded to, can help or hurt you in terms of your ability to start, restart, scale, and so So that's one of the more important things that we found with customers is that selection of that orchestrator drives a lot of their future plans for applications. So setting up the CI/CD pipeline and especially getting that feedback into the DevOps loop is key. And as Randy alluded to, monitoring those components of that pipeline to ensure that once I have this pipeline up, that if I do make a change in the application, it does get deployed out into production. If that doesn't happen for you, all your modernization efforts have gone away. So keep making sure that performance of that pipeline is good is as important as making sure the performance of the application itself is good. And one of the things we've also ran into, as Randy alluded to, is how do you deploy new upgrades? We're looking at things like blue-green patterns or feature flags, for example. A lot of these patterns are new to customers because in the past they've had to, essentially an upgrade was, you take down the server or you deploy all the pieces out and it's a weekend operation. Now we're talking about doing upgrades every day, essentially. And so they need other patterns that they have not ever practiced before because it just wasn't feasible when it took, days to do an upgrade. Now it's taken seconds to do an upgrade. And so they can do a lot of different things like A/B testing that they never even thought about doing before. So this delivery of the modernized app to production brings up a lot of new capabilities that in almost all cases they haven't thought of or they had heard of but have never even tried. And then obviously being able to communicate all this back to the business stakeholders is huge because that's really ultimately what's going to drive future efforts in modernizing applications.
Yeah. So Ken, I want to add in a couple comments to that. So I fully agree with those things you said, and then just to reiterate that point, you've talked about the frequency of change, et cetera. One of the things we'll make sure you talked up front, and I also commented on the need for the baseline. And it's important to do this baseline and do a diff after every push, right? Understand that you are improving on the business goals, improving on performance, or at least staying equal to the previous level, right? And not degrading. So it's not a do it at the beginning, do it at the very end. I don't know if there ever is an end because we'll continue to modernize, but it's after every push. But one other thing I wanted to allude to is you talked about from an orchestrator and I call it the dynamic aspect it has into the app deployment with respect to scaling and restarting and all the various frequency of pushes. Your application is changing frequently, the deployment model, not just the code level, right? And one of the things that we've added in our APM, because we found this to be so critical, is what I'll call a time-oriented topology. So keeping track of this topology over time and the changes. So you want to go back. You might have done a push right around the same time it did a scale out, and a few things restarted. So you got multiple versions. It's scaling out. Some things have restarted. What did it look like 2 minutes ago? What did it look like 2 hours ago when you might have encountered a problem? So you can't just look at what does it look like now, because now is quite different. So a lot of topologies look at the current, and this allows you to go back and almost replay, if you would, the changes that happened, right? So we capture every change so that you can actually see what happened and occurred and what might have alluded to, or you also need to understand how it affected the metrics, because if you're looking at a graph and the graph's an aggregate, well, obviously scale out, the graph could look different, the values, than scale in. So we actually map those, if you would, those activities to the metrics, right, to the metric graphs. So you can actually see points in time where a code got pushed or a scale out or a restart or move to a different mode, so you can understand how that activity or that change has an impact, if you would, onto the performance metrics. So that's a key aspect, those two things, the activity overlay of the metrics as well as that time-oriented topology. I want to get those 2 points.
Well, and that also leads to the essentially the view of pets versus cattle. Previously everything was pets. I mean, you looked at metrics based upon, for example, a server more than you probably did an application. Whereas now, since you don't even know what a server is, it's a container that has some oddball ID to it. Now you're actually more worried about the cattle and the fact that you're worried about the application and not so much about a server. And so those views of the metrics are on an aggregate more now than they ever were in the past, I think.
Yeah. And in fact, that's a great lead into my next couple charts. So if you want to explain. So next two charts, I kind of want to talk about some of the challenges. And this kind of gets, as you are into the modernization, the far end, refactoring into microservices, right, aspect. And there's a couple things you need to think about. And one of the things I say is, how you monitor, the approach to monitoring has to change now. And what I mean from that is how we traditionally monitored, monolithic apps in a data center, right? That concept needs to change. And we've talked about the first part of this, rate of change, right? And when I say today, I mean before you started to modernize your app, right? You typically would deploy that app. It'd take months to deploy, and that app version of that app could live for years, right? But now, Ken alluded to deploy, we're going to deploy in seconds, new container based. And in fact, some of these containers, microservices, they get spawned up to do one simple task and go away. They live for literally minutes. Some will live for hours. So not every microservice is a long living entity, right? And then you got to think of, so there's that rate of change, and then you got to think about the scale factors. And this is just one example. This isn't going to be everybody's example, but if you do go in the cloud, you're going to be across various regions. You're going to have availability zones. You could have hundreds of containers. So you're going to be into the thousands, if not greater, instances of containers out there. So again, remember that scale aspect when you think about how to monitor. So if we used today's approach, which today most people will monitor the resources about somewhere between a minute to 5 minutes. I've seen some people monitor every closer to 10 minutes. That's a sampling poll, right? Probably more common is close to the minute. But if you think about it, and I showed 3 examples, and actually this came from a paper by Lucas Gavinsky who wrote, if you take a look at short-lived microservice, which many are, and you monitor at typical low-frequency sampling, on the left is the left part of the left row. It shows the real curves of these services and what you would actually be plotting in a traditional monitoring system. Says they don't even align with the availability and performance of that service. In fact, the middle one wouldn't even be detected. So how do you do that? Well, then you have to increase your frequency of sampling, right? In some cases, sub-second, right? In others, 10, 15 seconds. Well, that won't scale. I mean, you're going to be collecting hundreds of millions of metrics, and and most of those aren't that useful, right? Probably the classic one is, I got to collect CPU utilization at a container level. No, you don't, right? So there's a different approach to how you have to monitor. So not every entity will be monitored at that because of this frequency problem. So, John, if you want to go to the next slide. The other piece you have to think about is the complexity, right? So you add in the scale and now the complexity. So what we used to do was, where was the complexity in the monolithic apps? It was inside the app. That's where the complexity was. Well, when you fully modernize your app into microservice, the complexity moves from what I call the inside, meaning the app itself, because many of these microservices are very simple, right? That's why you break them down into very small, very specific functional entities. So the code itself is relatively simple inside one microservice. Now the complexity has moved to the infrastructure, the runtime. So you have, the gateways, API gateways. You have service routing along with service discovery. Load balancing has to go on. These microservices will use back-end services, whether it be a messaging service or store, like maybe in Cassandra, Mongo, or they may be messaging across Kafka or something like that, right? We already talked about the build automation, but along with this, there's usually some config services, identity provider, because they have to ensure that the caller of the REST API, the OAuth 2 credentials passed or valid, things like that. Now it becomes a much more complex environment you have to monitor. It's less about the app and more about the complexity. And as we talked about, many moving parts, right? Multiple pushes of the different updates to the app, auto scaling out or in, killing, restarting, potentially restarting other nodes, many, many moving parts. And so you have to start thinking about, no longer is it monitoring every single container, but I have to think about monitoring the places where the problems occur. And this is where APM is great at, because it's less about instrumenting for a single resource, and it can ensure, one, the application or the service API is available and responsive. We talked about that. And it can ensure the backend dependencies are available and responsive. These are the various lines in this complex graph that you can start to ensure. And it can also, like I said, discover and understand the topology. And it's less about each instance of the microservice or container, and it's more about the service that is exposed. And another principle we ought to think about, again, different way of monitoring. You don't have to monitor every single container, because the larger the group of components, by definition, the more stable that collective group is, right? So although these individual small microservices can constantly be changing, the overall application that provides the complete business value, which is the aggregate of all these microservices, will remain more stable. So what's your time, John? If you want to go to the next chart. So the last chart on the monitoring aspect is to summarize a lot of those key things we've been talking about. One of the things we talked about, it's important that I think we start thinking about, I've heard APM talking about shift left. I like to talk about shift right as well. So how some of the operation aspects, what they typically monitor in operations, needs to move into dev, so that we can have, obviously, it's cheaper to find the problems earlier, but in some cases, you have to do that monitoring earlier to discover it, because it doesn't scale into production, as we just talked about. You also want some of the concepts in dev go all the way through production. I'll talk about that. And this will be needed to do some of the monitoring earlier if you're going to support the business needs or frequency of changes, and that you don't have a long, gated quality test cycle to get them into production. And it's also very important to have a single source of both ops and dev use the same APM. You have a single source of information. This not only accelerates problem determination when ops finds a problem, turns out dev, but it also eliminates any finger pointing. One's not saying I see it at 57, the other saying no, it's 28, right? So the data is common. Some of the things APM can help you with, obviously, earlier debugging, pushing that back into dev. APM provides detailed tracing, log consumption analysis. You can find this. All right. You can also, what we recommend is people start to test within dev. You're talking about a single microservice, and then it'll aggregate as you go down the pipeline. But earlier, look at your single service. APM can provide proactive testing and use that as an availability gate before you promote the code, right? And think of your tests as actual artifacts of the microservice or of the service that they're providing. So when you push the new code into production, you're also going to push the test. So like in a blue-green deployment, when I'm deploying the new release, before I start to route any traffic, I'm also deploying that monitor, which is a proactive test. It monitors the new deployed instance. Is it available? Yes. Is it performing? Yes. Is it the same level of performance I've seen them test or in development? Yes. Now I can start routing traffic, and guess what? I continue to use that test to ensure continuous availability and responsiveness of the app. So now these proactive or synthetic tests become part of the development phase, but they're also part of the service and get promoted into production to help ensure a successful blue-green deployment, and continuous to ensure that the application and is continuously available and responsive. And that includes, as new features are created, you obviously have to change the test in dev, and those tests then get promoted to prod. So you're testing to make sure all the new capabilities are available to your end users, right? Again, we talked about measuring dependencies. Also want to talk about the granular resource consumption. In dev is when you really want to see, does my container or set a container pod, does it really consume more resources than the previous? Do a diff after every update to the code. This is where you can do container level. You can understand if a container is using more disk, using more CPU, having a memory leak or whatever. Because when you get into production, you want to look at it at the application levels we talked about. Looking at the individual container level does not scale. So do your diffs in dev with APM, and then you can push into the top, into production. They can look at the application level and at the overall auto scaling aspect, right? And so, John, you want to go on the next chart? I think Ken will summarize here, and we'll have a few minutes for questions.
Okay, just wanted to give a couple of client examples in terms of how performance factored into the modernization efforts of a couple of our clients. When we first started this, we were at an insurance company, a large insurance company. They're looking at one of their actuarial apps. They ran it on the weekends. It ran on some high-end workstations. It wasn't scalable. It wasn't available. It was always going down, and they were way behind on their studies that they were doing from the actuarial perspective. We came in and up front, we looked at the performance. What does it look like today? And then we took them down the path of modernizing the application, converting it into containers, and they realized all the benefits of being able to scale it and making it more available. They now are able to run it in hours instead of days. They're able to run it during the week instead of on the weekends, and so on. They got a lot of benefits out of that modernization, but as part of that, as Randy was alluding to, we actually put in some tests at the unit level so that they were measuring performance at the unit level rather than having to go all the way to the end and on a weekend test to see if their performance got better. They were doing automated tests as their programmers were making changes. They were doing automated tests to look at the performance. And so that gave them that more quick feedback that they weren't experiencing before, and they were getting that because now that they could run their tests in seconds instead of days. And so that's a case where we looked at performance up front, and it had benefits all the way through the whole modernization effort. We went through a similar modernization effort at an agribusiness company, and explicitly when we were going through the questions up front, they really weren't interested in performance. That wasn't a concern of theirs. They didn't see the need to look at it. So we spend less time up front looking at that. After a couple of weeks there, and we'd modernized their application, all of a sudden they had lots of questions about performance. All of a sudden they were like, oh, I can see that it's more available now. I can see it's more scalable. But they didn't have the background to say how much more. And so, that was one of the lessons we learned is even though may not be interested in it, they are going to be interested in it at the end and ongoing. We went into a third company, a financial services company, and they basically said, we don't need your help doing this. We got this. We have some people who say they know what containers are, and lo and behold, they actually went off and built their application on containers completely wrong. And so we actually came in at the end in this case and actually helped them to come in, and performance again, availability, scalability, expandability, and so on were all concerns at the end. And so we actually had to retrofit that performance measurement into their modernization efforts. And so if I could say anything, it's one, measuring that performance baseline up front is huge. You have to do it. Even if you don't think it's going to be a problem or it's not a concern of yours, once you get to the end of modernization, just like Randy alluded to, you're going to end up in a situation where, the scalability and availability questions are going to, that scope is going to increase so much that you're not going to be able to wrap your head around it. You're going to have numbers to show it. So that's, some examples of clients we've had and the need for measuring performance throughout the process. So that's what I had there. Randy, do you have any comments on this slide?
No, I think we'll turn it over for questions looking at the clock. We went a little over.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got about 6 minutes left here, guys. So I do want to go ahead and get into the questions now. We have received some questions, but we do have time. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please feel free to use that control panel and submit your questions, and we'll do our best to get through all the questions before the end of the webinar. Okay, our first question. As customers modernize their applications, what are some of the things that they typically miss with respect to monitoring?
So this is Randy, I'll start, and we can let the others chime in what they've seen. I think what people tend to look at is, like I said, they start with their app because that's what they're focused on modernizing, right? And they get the things like, okay, we got to do load balancing, service discovery, et cetera. What they miss are some of the things that are still single point of failures, like maybe certificate management, or some of the, we talked about like the DNS or even the LDAP backend for authentication. Those are all critical pieces, and they tend to not think about those and monitor those because they're back to the core application function and not these ancillary services, which are single point of failures in many cases.
Yeah, and I'd just follow that up by, I think most customers don't realize the scale they'll be going to. They tend to think in one server, one application, and so on. They don't start thinking about, especially when they're talking about microservices, they don't realize the scale that that's going to encompass. And now all of a sudden you're talking about, instead of one, you're talking about tens or hundreds of containers that you're having to monitor, having to measure performance on, having to log. They just don't realize the scale that it's going to get to quickly.
And that's a good point. Let me just start with the network is important, right? Because, and again, I'm saying that about load balance and things like that, because as Ken mentioned, the scale means you have a lot of applications between parts, right? They kind of don't think about that.
Well, I know we mentioned this earlier, but I think it definitely bears repeating. When you think about what's changing here fundamentally in the application development process, and that is the tools that run your build. When you push an update, what's going to get it into production? That tooling becomes an essential part of your operations process. So Randy was mentioning traditional things like security and name resolution, things of that nature, but broaden the aperture there, and think about the fact that there are more things now that you have to think about that are really essential to the overall health and operation of your application.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Next question: are there types of applications that are better candidates for cloud and containerization? And then what characteristics are pro or con?
Well, this again, I'll start. I mean, obviously, where companies start at in terms of their modernization efforts, we usually suggest that a couple of factors play into that as to what apps they start with. Obviously, they have to be representative of what their business does. I mean, you don't want to take some app it's the only one of its kind. You want to take something that's representative of what they do. You got to make sure that there are some needs associated with that app in terms of scalability, availability, and so on. And that obviously you have some engineering knowledge of the app. You don't want to take an app that was been left on the floor for years and nobody knows anything about it. I mean, those are the three keys as to where you start with those applications. And then the rest after that is really driven by the business.
And I think, Ken, there's also a technical thing that we have that, I mentioned earlier some of the scars. So we've found that there are certain types of middleware components out there that, for example, might have dependencies on privileged access to features of the kernel, for example, which when you've got a couple of layers of containerization between that component and the OS kernel, then it really doesn't lend itself to be a good candidate for containerization at all. So especially with some of the legacy components we see out there, some messaging middleware components, for example, we've found that some of them really do things that preclude, from a technological perspective, that they run well in containers.
All right, great. Well, it looks like we're running into the top of the hour, so that's going to be the last question, unfortunately. If we didn't get to your question, know that the panelists will be receiving everybody's questions, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you post-event. Also, if you missed any or all part of today's event, please know that you will be able to access it on demand. Give us about an hour or so, and then you'll be receiving an email that's got the link to the webinar on demand. You can also find the webinar on demand on DevOps.com. Also check DevOps.com for other webinars that we have coming up. Hopefully there'll be one or two that pique your interest. But for now, I'd like to thank John Dinger, Ken Ryder, and Randy George. All of you guys, thank you so much for being on the webinar today. It was a fascinating discussion. So I hope that the audience got as much out of it as I did. This is Charlene O'Hanlon. I'm signing off, and everybody have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlene.